Okay, before we actually get to some painting of the first project, I think it's a good idea to get your feet wet by just doing some experimentation, some becoming used to the surface of watercolor on paper and the process by doing just a practice go at it. Like warming up before you run around the track or work in the gym. I've got a sheet on a wooden panel. You can use anything that's stable. You can even use the back of a tablet, just so that you're working on an area that's separate from all the other sheets. So in case there's an accident with spillage of water, you're not going to damage the rest of your paper. So what I've got here is your tape, your painter's tape, and I'm just going to go ahead and use some of this to hold it down so that it doesn't become unstable while you're working on it. About half the tape is on the sheet and half is on the wood. It'll just make it so much easier to move around, and you're not trying to hold a flimsy sheet of paper down while you're painting on it. So this ensures that. I got a little piece here I need to catch right here. I'm at school. I'm in the painting studio. It's just too hot on my back porch, and the neighbor decided he was going to trim his trees today. So there's a lot of noise out on the back porch, so I just came over here. Excuse the echo, but it's an empty room. So I've got my tape down. I've got my palette with some color on it. I've got my water containers here, one that I'm going to use to clean out dirty brushes, and one I'm going to try to keep as clean as possible, just so that I can make sure that I don't contaminate color when I'm dipping into a new color after having just used another. I've got my brushes out here. So I'm going to go ahead and also, because this is the standard sheet of paper, we're not going to do anything really large on this initial go at watercolor. I'm going to divide it in half, and I'm going to treat each half a little differently, just so that you can see what's meant by wet on wet and what's meant by wet on dry. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a brush, load it up with water, and I'm going to dampen the sheet, the half of the sheet over on the left side. So this is going to be a demo of wet on wet here. I'm going to soak it pretty good. This is a 140 pound paper, yeah, which is a good thickness, so it's not going to curl up on you. I'm going to leave the other side alone. So I'm going to let that soak in, and I'm using a really soft brush, a big one, cheap one, because it's shedding, but it's easy to get the hair off with watercolor than it is with acrylic. And so now I'm going to get a smaller brush here, and I'm going to put in some color, dip in my clean water. I'm going to grab a little blue, put some here. Okay. I'm going to lay some out. There we go. Very liberally here. Y'all can see, because I've got my camera overhead, because I think it's important for you to be able to see the top and bottom of the image, and because unlike drawing and painting with oil or acrylic, you can use an easel, but because with watercolor you have to be conscious of the dripping or the gravity of the water in the process, that it has to be flat. And so I have to have the camera positioned in such a way that you can see that. I'm going to introduce a different blue here. By the way, if you can see the palette, I think you can. Let me show you. Remember I was talking to you about cheap paint and good quality paint. This is Grumbacher. That's the Grumbacher stuff I showed you in the Introduction to Materials video. There it is. Okay, now this and this is cheap paint. It's, I don't even remember the name of it, but it was not very expensive, but look at it. You see how watery it is. And so the pigment is minimized in the liquid that's used to, used to make it fluid so it can go in the tube. So you see you got a lot of junk in there, but I'm going to use it up anyway. So let's go ahead and take some of this cheap stuff. I'm going to work it just so that you can see the difference in color. Even though it's cheap paint. I really love this blue. This is cerulean blue or phthalo blue. Now remember I told you that it would be a good idea to have a squirt bottle. Well, believe it or not, my paint is already starting to dry. My paper's starting to dry, so I need to wet it some more. So I'm going to go ahead and just take a wet brush, and I'm going to go ahead and just dampen it up here and freshen the moisture in the paper. And I'm going to work some of it up here as well. Okay, now I'm going to start to come back, and I'm going to work this new blue up into the blue that I started out with. Okay, now you see those strokes? They're probably a little bothersome to you, but you can take that gravity issue I was talking about and take it to your advantage, or make it your advantage. You can just pick this up a little and tilt it. You can also tip it this way. You can tip it to the left. Tip it to the right. Again. And then you can get rid of that the brush stroke and get a more blurred, blended quality to it. I'm also going to get my atomizer bottle and keep it handy. It's actually got some color in it, which is another way. I forgot to clean this out. Now this is a squirt bottle that I was going to use for water, but it's got a little bit of paint in it, so I could apply paint that way. So now you're seeing another technique that's possible. It's by total accident, and I'm going to blur that into that area there, so that the spritz disappears. Okay. All right. So with wet on wet, you're actually putting color into wet color, as opposed to letting it dry, which happens a lot with, for instance, oil paint and acrylic painting. Right. Although wet on wet is certainly applicable to those two media, but most of the time you're not able to work as quickly on an acrylic painting as is expected with the watercolor process. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to introduce another color. I'm going to let that blend. little. Okay. And we're going to give this another coat. But I'm going to take a totally different hue. I'm going to take a little yellow. And I'm going to take some yellow, cadmium yellow. Now I'm changing hues, and it's important to remember what's going to happen when you mix blue and yellow. You're going to get green. So it's really important to remember what happens with color mixture. So I don't want to have green here, so I need to leave a gap. So you want to remember that that's important if you're looking at applying colors. For instance, like if you're doing a sky that has orange and blue in it, or orange, blue, and yellow, you want to be careful about those colors touching while they're wet. So you're going to need to leave a gap here. We need to make sure there's plenty of water in the paper. Okay. And so now I'm going to apply some of that yellow, but I'm going to leave a gap right in here between the blue and the yellow. And once again, I'm going to tilt a little bit. You see, when you're using wet on wet, whenever you put a loaded brush down and the paper is wet, you're not going to get a stiff edge. Okay. Now this side over on the right is dry. So you see, when I put yellow here, you see how it keeps the edge of the stroke. Okay. So this is what happens in wet on dry, and you get blurred edges or blended edges when you work with wet on wet. Okay, so again, how do you know which technique to use? Well, a lot of that has to do with what you're painting. Okay, and so if you're painting a still life of an object that's real close to you, like your first painting is going to be of a tomato or an apple or something like that. It's going to be isolated. It's going to be one thing. So it's going to be looking like it's just, maybe 12 to 14 inches away from you. So you wouldn't see a blurry edge on that apple. You would see a crisper edge. Okay. So remember, when you wet the paper and when you don't. And so now let me do a little more of the wet on dry here. I'm going to take a little more of this yellow. Okay, so again, you can get sharper edges here, more definite strokes. And again, that depends on the subject you're painting or the style that you're painting in to determine and give you some insight into how that's going to happen. Okay, now let me change hues. I'm going to use a little red, and this yellow is still wet, so now I'm going to work a little of the red into that, and of course it's going to turn it orange. Okay, but you see how it's only staying within that wet area. Okay, so when you have dry paper and you're putting your wet watercolor on it, you have that possibility to your advantage as well. Okay, here again, this is still wet. I can still see the water sitting on the surface of the paper, so now I can come back and I can change the color slightly to make it a little more orange. But you see how I can make it orange only in certain areas or certain spots, because there's so much water still sitting on that brush stroke and it's not bleeding. Here it's bleeding. If I put a little red onto this here, look at how it wants to spread and ooze over the rest of the moist yellow area, you see. So again, you want to play around to see what happens when you're working with wet paper or when you're working with dry paper. Okay. All right, this is still very wet. Now what happens when I put a little red into that blue? Same way, I'm just going to drop it right in there, and then it's going to start to want to ooze into the moisture of blue, and once again I can tilt it or I can spread it around here. Now, although I'm not making anything in particular here, you can kind of see there's a landscapish kind of quality to this. Since I've got horizon lines, anytime you have a horizon, you're suggesting a landscape of some type. And I'm going to exploit that a little right now by taking a little ochre here. And I'm going to indicate a little of this area having a kind of mountain or cliff reference. Remember in my introduction video, I talked about how less, detail is a strong consideration when working in watercolor. And there's probably a nicer way to think about it is the saying less is more. Less, and then exploit that by suggesting a particular kind of surface rather than having to hold the viewer by the hand and illustrate it. You're not using this as a tool for replacing the camera. You're suggesting. So I'm going to take a burnt sienna here. Now, because burnt sienna and yellow ochre are so close together in terms of warmth, then I can go ahead and use this and go ahead and let some of that blend into the yellow ochre. It's not going to be a big deal. Of course, if I take this up into the blue, then we've got a different story there. And I can go a little heavier here to suggest a more recessed pocket of a crevice here. And do another one in this area as well, just to begin to suggest variations in the surface of that mountain. Okay. But see what's possible. Right? I'm going to come back over here. Of course, this is dry, but you see how sharp that edge is. Just so that you can see the difference. Again, I'm going to do a little tilting over here. I'm going to come back in this direction. I'm going to come back to this darker blue that I used at the very beginning. I think I need a little more on my palette. And I'm going to proceed to lay in a little more of that blue at the top. Just to get a stronger variation in the sky so that it doesn't all seem so flat and even. I will do my tilting thing again here. Now, if I had a hair dryer, I could, take the hair dryer to this, speed up the drying, and I could wet this whole surface again and lay in another layer of the blue to darken, or another layer of the yellow ochre here. Another thing that's possible, because the water tends to pool on the paper for a while, you have some time to blot. And you can remove that area. I'm also going to take a little water on the paper towel, and I'm going to pick up, see, and allow for a little unevenness in the sky. Remove some of that blue. Okay, I'm going to lay in something else there, perhaps a little yellow or a little pink later on. Okay. Another thing that's possible with regards to texture is you can take sponges and you can also begin to add variation to the surface. Because it's so flimsy, using a sponge is so easy to use, because you don't have a lot of thick paint to clog it up. So it allows you to keep the mark. You can even use that back scrubber side to create a slightly different texture as well. Okay, so it's possible to go beyond just using the normal paint tool of the paintbrush and get yourself into some different textures. I'm going to go into some more variety here. I've still only used one brush, so you can do a lot on this size with one brush, but I'm going to bring some foreground in here. I'm going to use a little green, and I'm going to mix it with some yellow, because the green that you're given in your set of colors is rather strong. It's an emerald green or a blue green, phthalo green, and so I want to certainly make it more earth-like by pulling a little yellow into it. And of course that's going to give me a lot more of a green that's going to be appropriate for a grass kind of color surface. And here, so that we've got this area, because the color is warmer, it pulls us close to the foreground here. I'm going to even take a little of the burnt sienna and work a little of that in here to add some variation to that green. And you just kind of poke with the brush to create a variety of different textures and surfaces that can seemingly become much crisper or clearer, even in the looseness and the gesture of your description. I'm also going to add just a tiny bit of black to my palette here, just to be able to create just a little stronger contrast. I'm going to maybe darken up that green just a tad, but without the blue. So I'm not making your emerald green again. So I can come back and create small pockets of a darker green here. All right. And I'm going to also use a little of the dark, the black with some sienna to create a darker earth color. And I'm going to try to use that to pull the foreground up closer. I'm going to use a little of this back here. So now it kind of sets off the lighter green in the foreground. I'm going to take this back up to the background here. I can bring the lightness of the green out by providing a little contrast. I just have to be careful. If I let this touch the green, then it's going to soak up the green into the brown, and I'll lose that color, the crispness of color. So I'm going to have to wait till that dries and then come back and add a little more variation to that. Don't forget, the white of the paper is important. Don't feel like you have to carry every square inch or cover every square inch. Here. I'm going to use the brush now, or excuse me, the sponge. And pick up and begin to add a little variation. Again, I want this to dry, and then I can come back in with a little more detail and variation. And I still want to darken the sky a bit more. It's a little on the soft side. Bring a little of that texture down here below as well. But over on your dry side here, again talking about a more definite shape, well, another thing that you can do, for instance, if I talked about having more definite edge, well, let's say I'm going to do that drawing or the painting of the apple. Okay, good. And just kind of generalize the shape here. Actually, it looks more like a bell pepper. I think I'll make it a bell pepper. Okay. Then what I can do is I can take my wet brush and I can wet only the boundary, within the boundary of that shape. My stalk here. Okay. And then I could take my green, and of course I can get that flowing blurred quality, but it's going to stay within the confines of that moistened area. Okay. This would be like my first blocking in of color for that bell pepper. Okay, and of course when that dries, either on its own or with the help of a hair dryer, well, then you can come back to it with